I was 58 when I was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, and I still hear, but you seem fine. Hi, my name is Carl, and in this video, I want to talk about the reality behind those comments, the hidden symptoms, and why we need to change the way we talk about dementia. When people say that to me, it feels like they're questioning my diagnosis, like I'm maybe too put together to actually have dementia. And I think that's because I still speak fairly clearly most of the time. I dress myself, I shave, I comb my hair, I do all those things. So I look pretty well put together. Um, and for the most part, I speak well. I always have. So people just assume that maybe I'm not as bad as I say I am or my family says I am. So when people say to me, well, you look good, you look fine, what I hear and what I feel like they're saying to me is I'm faking it or I'm lying about my diagnosis and what I'm going through. And I feel like I'm not being believed or understood. What I think they mean is that I don't match the image in their mind. They picture someone old, even older than me. And I know I look older than dirt, but they think of someone who is sitting in a nursing home, kind of staring blankly into space, maybe a little drool coming down the side of their mouth, all looking all disheveled, their hair not combed, they're in pajamas, and they just look like someone who has an illness. And so I think that's the picture that people have in their head. When you say someone has dementia, that's the picture. They immediately go to someone who is in the end stages of dementia. And that stereotype is not only hurtful, it's also harmful. So what people think dementia looks like versus the reality is very different. Oftentimes very different. As I said, I was 58 when I was diagnosed, but my symptoms began probably 2 to 3 years before I was diagnosed. And that is early, and I was younger than many people who are diagnosed with dementia. Many people are not diagnosed and do not really end up with, kind of full-blown dementia until they're much older, in their 70s, and sometimes even older than that, if they develop it at all, because not everyone does. But as we're getting better about detection and diagnosis, we're finding that we're able to diagnose some of these things early. So when you think about what dementia looks like versus the reality of most people, as I said, imagine, someone very, and that's oftentimes true. But as I said, that's not me. I try to stay active, and many people I know who have been diagnosed with dementia do everything they can to stay as active as they can, both socially and physically, so that they can slow the progression of the disease. I work out to the best of my ability to stay strong and limber. And I try to create content like this. And I write a blog as well. And, I do my advocacy work where I spend time like this trying to erase the stigma around dementia. So I'm trying to choose kind of grace over bitterness. I know a lot of folks who get diagnosed with dementia sink into bitterness and depression. And I did as well when I first got diagnosed. But, over time, I've come to accept it, and I choose to live with grace and not bitterness. So dementia doesn't always look like what people expect. So some of the invisible symptoms that people with dementia experience that people don't readily see go beyond forgetfulness. Forgetfulness is just the beginning, oftentimes. There are other hidden symptoms that become much more pronounced and severe with someone living with dementia, and those include sudden depression or apathy, agitation over the smallest of things, confusion, disinterest in hobbies or things that they've always wanted to do, a lack of ability to focus or a lack of attention for very long. These are all invisible symptoms that we experience that people don't often see readily. And a lot of times what happens when we begin to exhibit these symptoms as someone living with dementia, or even before we're diagnosed, as we're trying to figure out what's going on, it oftentimes brings a feeling of isolation and shame. We should be able to do better. I know for myself, when I was working still full time toward the end, when my symptoms were really just completely out of control, I was living 2 hours away from home. I lived in an apartment by myself, so I was very isolated. Isolation is not good for someone who lives with dementia. And for me, there were days when I couldn't get out of bed. I mean, I knew I had to get up and get going. I had meetings to attend. I had legislative sessions I needed to go to. There were calls I had to make, emails I had to answer, people I had to reach out to, and I just could not muster cognitive energy or the desire to do any of it. And I would beat myself up because I did not know what was going on. That's incredibly difficult for someone who is used to being out there and being in charge, and pushing forward and, leading the way, and to suddenly fall into, and it would last for days on days. It was very isolating and made me feel very ashamed of myself, very embarrassed that I couldn't do what I used to do, that I no longer wanted to do it. And I loved my job. Those are things that are easily seen, but they are very real. And I think that one of the things that I've had to learn to come to grips with, and I think that most people don't understand, even sometimes those of us who are living with dementia, that apathy and depression are not choices that we make. These are things that are happening to us because of the brain disease, not because we're choosing. And so when we're not able to do something, when we're not interested in doing something, that's not laziness, that's dementia. And I think that that's one of the reasons why early detection matters so much. And we're getting better at it. Not great, but we're getting better. Too often the early symptoms get brushed off. We look at someone and say, well, you know what? They're a little forgetful. It's okay. Early diagnosis gives you options for medication, for physical therapy, for speech therapy, which is incredibly important, especially early lifestyle changes, changes of diet, exercise, social interactions. You can create a plan. If you're living with symptoms and you don't time to find out what's going on, you just keep putting it up. You're just living with the unknown, which then becomes larger in your mind. If you find out what's going on, as difficult as it is, because certainly the day I got my diagnosis, it was very difficult. But from that moment on, my wife and I were able to make a plan moving forward, what we were going to do. And that plan has evolved. having an early diagnosis allows you to do those things. So how the word dementia sometimes changes conversations. It absolutely changes how people treat me. I remember being in the hospital last year when I had pneumonia. And when the nurse found out that I had Lewy body dementia, she leaned over me and she started yelling in my ear like I was I'm speaking very slowly, like I was a 2-year-old. And so even though I was in a lot of pain and not really with it, I had to laugh. And I said to her, I'm not deaf. I just have dementia. And she was a little taken aback. She got over it. But I often find that that is the response. People either talk louder or they talk slower, like they're talking to a child, or they simply ignore me and they stop talking to me and they turn and start talking to Michelle as if I wasn't there. I've had many medical professionals who have done that when we've been in a situation. As soon as they find out that I have dementia, they turn from me and they start talking to Michelle. And I've had to gently remind them, I'm the patient, I'm completely lucid, I'm here. I may have dementia, but I'm not an idiot. And doctors don't always like to be corrected, but my feeling is I'm the patient. So I try to use humor to break the tension in those situations, like, they have dementia, not deafness. And then, if somebody else is having an issue, I'll say, well, wow, I thought I was the only one that had memory issues. And sometimes that helps to break the ice and make people feel, okay, A, he hasn't completely lost it. And B, it's okay to laugh about these things because you do have to laugh. So humor helps, at least for me. I try to laugh every day, usually at myself. But it reminds people that I'm still me, that I'm not a stereotype, and I'm not a ghost. I'm still here. I'm still present. And we need to remember that with people who live with dementia, that they're still present. They're still there. They're not a ghost. And that we need to continue to treat them like the adults and the people that they were. And treat them with that level of respect and dignity and honor and love. Even if they can't always respond the way they used to, they're still receiving it the way you're giving it. The stigma of the word dementia, because it scares people. They think it means that life is over. If you get a diagnosis of dementia, you think, okay, my life is over. When other people hear that you have dementia, they think your life is over. Again, they go back to that stereotype of what they have in their mind about someone living with dementia. Some families hide it. They never tell anyone that their loved one has dementia. Oh, they're ill. They're not feeling well today. They never get help. They never get the support that they need from their community or from their family and friends. And some care partners just carry it alone. They don't tell anyone until it's much too late. That isolation, it hurts everyone. It hurts everyone involved. We need connection. We all need connection as human beings, but even more so as our brains go through changes brought about by a disease. We need that social interaction. It helps to keep the neurons firing. It helps to keep our brain active as much as it can be. Social interaction has shown to slow the progression of dementia. So the more people are socially interactive, the more they have friends, the more they try to engage in community activities, in community outreach, the more likely it is that the disease will not progress as rapidly. Watching television is simply not enough. Yelling at the television is As fun as that may be sometimes, it's not a social interaction. But I have found that the stigma of dementia shuts doors. Friends really no longer call. They no longer come to visit because they're not sure of how to act. They're not sure of what to say. They're not sure of how to behave. They're not sure of how I will behave. And so they kind of fade away. A lot of friends still interact through things like Facebook and Messenger, things like that, which is great. That's fine. But the human interaction of face-to-face dialogue and interaction don't always occur. And that's difficult. I think one of the things that many people with dementia struggle with is that as their friends kind of fall away and the invitations stop coming for backyard barbecues or birthday parties or family dinners, because they're not really sure what dad or mom are going to do, how they're going to act, what they're going to say. So they just simply don't invite them. They just keep them at arm's length, thinking it's better for them, better for you, it's better for everyone. And those things take a toll over time as we become more isolated. So stigma can shut doors. And my goal is to open windows. If the door gets shut, I'm going to try to open a window somewhere. I guess some final thoughts is just because I don't look like I have dementia doesn't mean I'm not fighting it every day. I've learned that I can live well with dementia. It looks different, but it's still a good life. And another thing that I think that people should really understand is that if you know one person living with dementia, you know one person living with dementia. Everyone is different because our brains are unique. So is our experience with something that affects the brain. So just because you think you may understand what dementia looks like because you know one person, doesn't mean that that same experience is going to translate to someone else. We're not all the same, but we all deserve the same level of caring, respect, and dignity. Regardless, we need to be seen for who we are, who we still are. So thanks for watching and for letting me share this part of my journey. If this video helped shift your perspective at all, give it a like, share it, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your story. And if you haven't, hit subscribe, all the YouTube things. More episodes are coming about life with Lewy, the good, the bad, the funny, and the in-between. Until next time, stay kind, be curious, and remember, not all disabilities are visible, but every person deserves to be seen.